Daniela, can you stay late tonight? The voice, belonging to my supervisor, Trevor, was a familiar and unwelcome intrusion into the focused rhythm of my afternoon. I didn't even have to look up from my monitor to picture him standing by my cubicle, his posture a carefully constructed blend of casual authority and underlying expectation. He always wore that look when asking for overtime, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk that suggested my compliance was a foregone conclusion. The Henderson account needs some adjustments before tomorrow's presentation, he continued, his tone smooth and unbothered. I finally lifted my gaze, letting it drift past him to the large wall clock. The hands pointed to 4:30 p.m. A heavy sigh formed in my chest, but I held it back, letting it dissolve into the quiet hum of the office. This was the third time this week. The third time my plans to leave on time were being casually dismantled by a last-minute, urgent request that, in all likelihood, could have been anticipated days ago. But I nodded anyway. It was what I did. It was who I was. Sure, Trevor. I'll get it sorted. He gave me a tight, satisfied smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and sauntered off toward his corner office, leaving me in the wake of his expensive, overbearing cologne. My name is Daniela Cortez, and at 38 years old, I had become the silent, indispensable backbone of Nexus One Logistics. For nearly 9 years, I had occupied this very cubicle in our sprawling Denver, Colorado office, serving as the regional operations analyst. My job title was a deceptively simple container for a vast and intricate set of responsibilities. I handled everything from managing our most complex client accounts to designing and integrating the very software systems that kept our entire supply chain, a multi-million-dollar-a-month operation, running smoothly across the vast Rocky Mountain region. My colleagues often joked that I was the human equivalent of our main server, always running, never complaining, and somehow essential to everything working properly. It was a comparison I found more accurate than they probably intended. I had built most of our current systems from scratch in the early years, created the labyrinthine filing protocols that everyone now used without a second thought, and personally cultivated the relationships with key vendors and shipping partners, relationships that Trevor often took credit for in board meetings with a polished, self-aggrandizing flair. Not that I minded much, or so I told myself. I found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the work itself, in the elegant challenge of solving logistical puzzles that others deemed impossible. My brain thrived on untangling knots, on seeing the patterns in the chaos. Daniela's on it had become Trevor's standard, almost reflexive, response whenever our CEO, Helen Brackmore, inquired about a particularly complicated project. He'd been my supervisor for 3 years now, ever since his lateral transfer from the Portland office. At 41, he possessed a freshly minted MBA from a respectable, but not top-tier, university and an inflated sense of his own importance that seemed to be a standard-issue accessory with a degree. He dressed in sharply tailored suits that were a size too tight and spoke in a cascade of business school jargon that often obscured rather than clarified his meaning. He relied on me more than he would ever admit, a dependency that was our unspoken, fragile contract. I did the work. He took the credit. In return, I had job security and the freedom to do what I did best without the burden of office politics. I pulled up the Henderson files, the familiar grid of spreadsheets and delivery manifests filling my screen. The office, once buzzing with the low murmur of late-afternoon productivity, was beginning to empty. The sounds of keyboards being tapped were replaced by the friendly chatter of goodbyes and the rustle of coats being pulled from the backs of chairs. Soon, I was one of the few left, bathed in the sterile fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. As I delved into the data, my phone buzzed on the corner of my desk. I glanced at the screen, my heart giving a small, painful lurch. It was a text from my mother. "Grandpa Elias is asking for you again. The doctors say it might be soon." I stared at the message, the crisp, black and white numbers on the spreadsheet blurring into a meaningless gray. A familiar, cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach, a knot of grief and guilt that had been tightening for months. My grandfather, Elias Cortez, was 87 years old and had been battling a degenerative lung disease for what felt like an eternity. He was a decorated World War II veteran, a man forged from steel and quiet resilience, who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. He was my rock, my anchor, the unwavering moral compass of my life. Everything I knew about resilience, about integrity, about the quiet strength found in doing what needed to be done, I had learned from him. "Everything okay?" Jenna's voice from the neighboring cubicles startled me. She was peering over the divider, her kind face etched with concern. She had seen my distraction, the sudden shift in my posture. "Just family stuff," I replied, forcing a smile that felt brittle and thin. "Nothing urgent." It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie you tell in an office to keep the personal and professional worlds from bleeding into one another. But as I worked late into the evening, updating spreadsheets and cross-referencing delivery schedules for the Henderson account, I could not shake the feeling that time was running out. Grandpa Elias had always been my anchor. He was the one person who truly understood my dedication to my work because he had lived his entire life with the same quiet commitment to duty. I wondered, with a fresh pang of sorrow, if he knew how much I still needed his guidance. The call I had been dreading came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, instantly awake with the kind of chilling clarity that comes only when you have been anticipating the worst kind of news. "Daniela, honey, it's time." My mother's voice was steady but strained, a thin thread of composure pulled taut over a well of grief. "Grandpa wants to see you." I drove through the empty, silent Denver streets to the hospital, my mind a frantic whirlwind racing between logistics and grief. I had to call Trevor, I had to arrange for my projects to be covered, I had to book a flight for my Aunt Teresa from Albuquerque. The practicalities were a welcome, if temporary, shield against the overwhelming sorrow. When I entered his room, Grandpa Elias looked smaller than I ever remembered, the proud, strong frame that had once seemed so indomitable now frail against the stark white sheets. But his eyes were still sharp, and they found mine the moment I walked in. He squeezed my hand with surprising strength, a faint, papery rustle of skin against mine. "There's my successful granddaughter," he whispered, his voice raspy but carrying that familiar, unwavering pride that had sustained me through every challenge of my life. "Tell me about work. Are they treating you right?" I sat by his bedside for hours, updating him on the Henderson account, the new efficiency protocols I had implemented, and the cost savings I had identified for our biggest clients. He listened intently, asking sharp, insightful questions that showed he understood the intricacies of my business better than most people half his age. Even as he faced his final hours, he wanted to hear about my achievements. "I taught you to work hard," he said, his grip tightening on my hand, "but I also taught you to stand up for yourself. Don't let anyone make you small, Daniela. You're worth more than they know." He passed away peacefully that Thursday morning, with me holding his hand and my mother stroking his forehead. His last words echoed in my mind, a final piece of guidance from the man who had shaped my world. The funeral arrangements fell naturally to me. I was the organized one, the problem solver, the one who could coordinate flowers and cemetery plots with the same methodical efficiency I brought to shipping manifests. I spent the next morning on the phone with Trevor. "I need to request bereavement leave," I said, my voice hoarse but professional. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "How much time are you talking about?" Trevor asked, his tone laced with impatience. 4 days. That should cover the funeral and the immediate family obligations. I've already prepared detailed notes for all my pending projects and recorded a few tutorial videos for the more complex procedures on the Henderson integration. Everything is covered. There will be minimal disruption. I had stayed at the office until 8 the previous night, ensuring my absence would be seamless. It was my professional creed. 4 days seems excessive, Daniela," he said, the condescension in his voice a physical thing, like a slap. "Can't you handle this over a weekend?" I felt a flash of hot anger, so intense it made my vision swim. My grandfather, my guardian, The man who was more of a father to me than anyone was gone, and my boss was quibbling over a weekend. He was my grandfather, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. There are veterans' burial arrangements to make, family members traveling from out of state, and legal matters to settle. 4 days is the company policy, and it is what I need. Trevor sighed dramatically, as if my grandfather's death was a profound personal inconvenience designed specifically to vex him.
Fine.
But make sure all your current projects are handed off properly. I don't want any client issues while you're gone. Of course, I replied, my mind already mentally organizing the handoff procedures, my professionalism a shield against the utter callousness of his words. The funeral was everything Grandpa Elias would have wanted, dignified, with full military honors at Fort Logan National Cemetery, and surrounded by people whose lives he had touched. I stood beside his casket, listening to the 3-volley salute echo across the vast Colorado plains, feeling proud and heartbroken in equal measure. My cousin Miguel flew in from Phoenix, and my Aunt Teresa came from Albuquerque. We spent hours sharing stories about Grandpa's stubbornness, his terrible jokes, and his unwavering belief that hard work and integrity were the only things that truly mattered. On Saturday evening, we found ourselves going through his papers, discovering medals he had never mentioned and letters from people whose lives he had quietly helped over the years. Teresa held up a yellowed newspaper clipping he had saved. It was an article from the Denver Business Journal about Nexus One winning a regional logistics award a few years back. My name was mentioned in a single sentence. He showed this to everyone at the senior center, Teresa said, her eyes welling up. He was so proud of your career, Daniela. I smiled through fresh tears, remembering how he always asked about my work with such genuine interest. He understood that my job was not just employment. It was a way of serving others, of keeping the complicated machinery of commerce running smoothly. Just like his military service, my work at Nexus One contributed to something larger than myself. Or so I had believed. Monday morning felt strange and hollow as I prepared to return to the office. I had taken exactly the 4 days Trevor had approved, and I had left everything in perfect order before my departure. My work phone had remained silent over the weekend. No urgent emails, no crisis calls, no indication that Nexus One had struggled in the slightest without me. I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual, ready to dive back into the Henderson project and catch up on anything that had accumulated. I badged into the building and walked toward my cubicle, noticing that the office seemed unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Then I saw it. My computer monitor was dark. When I tried to log in, the system displayed a stark, impersonal error message. Access denied. Contact it administrator. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Daniela? Jenna appeared beside me, her face pale and uncomfortable. Trevor wants to see you in his office. Right away. I grabbed my coffee mug, my hand strangely steady, and headed toward Trevor's office. I assumed there was some technical glitch that needed resolving. Maybe the system had automatically deactivated my credentials during my absence, or perhaps there was an urgent client issue that required my immediate attention. I knocked on his door frame and stepped inside. Good morning, Trevor. I'm back and ready to jump into whatever needs attention. He did not look up from his computer screen. His focus was absolute, his dismissal of my presence complete. Actually, Daniela, there's been a change. The way he said it, so clipped and final, made my stomach drop. But I maintained my professional composure. What kind of change? Trevor finally looked at me, his expression a mask of cold, bureaucratic indifference. I've decided to go in a different direction with your position. Your employment with Nexus One is terminated, effective immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, rooted to the spot, processing what he had just said, certain I had misunderstood. I'm sorry. What did you just say? Your position has been eliminated, he repeated, his tone suggesting this was a routine administrative matter, like updating a software patch. We need team members who demonstrate unwavering commitment to their responsibilities. Taking 4 days off, even for personal reasons, shows where your priorities lie. I felt my face flush with a mixture of disbelief and a slow-burning rage. Trevor, you approved my bereavement leave. I submitted the proper paperwork, received written approval, and ensured all my projects were covered before I left. He shrugged dismissively. Approval doesn't mean I have to like it. This company needs people who put work first, who understand that our clients depend on us. When you choose family over professional obligations, it sends a message about your dedication. I buried my grandfather, I said, my voice rising despite my every effort to remain calm. He was a World War II veteran who raised me after my parents died. This wasn't a vacation. It was honoring the man who taught me everything about responsibility and commitment. That's very touching, Trevor replied, his sarcasm cutting deep. But personal circumstances don't excuse professional lapses. Your decision to prioritize personal matters over client needs demonstrates that you're not the right fit for our culture. I stared at him, the carefully constructed world I had built over 9 years crumbling in real time. 9 years of exemplary service, 9 years of staying late and solving impossible problems, 9 years of building the very systems that kept this company running, all erased because I had dared to grieve properly. A former colleague, Maya, called me that afternoon. Daniela, I just heard what Trevor did to you, she said, her voice tight with anger. I need to tell you something, but you have to promise to keep this confidential until I figure out how to handle it. Of course, I replied, curious about her urgency. Trevor's been taking credit for your work in executive meetings, she began. Last month, he presented your entire Henderson account optimization plan as his own strategic initiative to the board of directors. Helen was so impressed that she's considering promoting him to regional manager. I felt a cold clarity settle over me as Maya continued describing Trevor's systematic appropriation of my accomplishments. He had not just fired me for grieving my grandfather, he had stolen my professional identity to advance his own career. The man who called me irreplaceable had been building his reputation on my innovations while positioning himself to eliminate the one person who could expose his incompetence. Maya, I said slowly, an idea beginning to form, I think Trevor just made the biggest mistake of his career. The next few days were a blur of activity. Instead of dwelling on anger or self-pity, I began researching the logistics consulting market in Colorado. Within 2 hours, I had identified 6 companies that specialized in supply chain optimization and 3 independent consultants who were earning significant fees for exactly the kind of work I had been doing at Nexus One. The difference was that consultants charged premium rates for project-based work, while employees accepted steady salaries for unlimited availability for Trevor's last-minute demands. I worked from my home office, feeling productive and valued in ways I had forgotten were possible. By Tuesday afternoon, I had created a professional website, updated my LinkedIn profile, and reached out to former vendors who had always praised my efficiency and problem-solving abilities. The response was immediate and encouraging. Wednesday morning brought my first consulting contract, a 2-week project analyzing distribution bottlenecks for a growing e-commerce company. The daily rate was more than I had earned weekly as a Nexus One employee, and the scope was limited to specific deliverables, rather than endless availability. For the first time in years, I was being compensated fairly for my expertise, rather than taken for granted. Thursday afternoon, while reviewing supply chain data for my second client, I received an unexpected phone call from a former Nexus One colleague who had left the company 6 months earlier. Daniela, I heard what happened at Nexus One. That's their loss and our gain. I have 3 clients who need exactly your expertise. As I discussed project scope with my new client, Helen Brackmore called a 3rd time. I let it go to voicemail and continued my consultation. That evening, I received a text from Jenna. The Henderson integration crashed completely. Trevor's been in emergency meetings all day. Helen looks furious. Everyone's asking where you are. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Grandpa Elias had taught me that the best revenge was not emotional satisfaction but professional excellence. By firing me for honoring his memory, Trevor had handed me the keys to my own liberation while ensuring his own professional destruction. My phone buzzed with another call from Helen. I set it aside and opened my laptop to work on my expanding consulting business. Some lessons, I reflected, could only be learned through consequences. Trevor was about to discover that competence could not be faked, that institutional knowledge could not be stolen, and that firing your most valuable employee during a crisis was a mistake that no MBA could fix. Monday morning brought the call I had been expecting. Helen Brackmore's voice was strained but professional when I finally answered at 10 a.m. after letting her wait through 3 previous attempts. "Daniela, thank you for taking my call," she began, her usual executive confidence replaced by barely controlled desperation. "I need to discuss a critical situation with you." "Of course, Helen," I replied calmly, sitting in my home office with contracts from 3 new consulting clients spread across my desk. "What can I help you with?" "The Henderson account integration has completely failed," she said, her words tumbling out rapidly. "The system crashed over the weekend, and we've lost access to all their shipping data. Their freight is backed up at 4 distribution centers, and they're threatening to terminate our contract unless we resolve this immediately." I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue. Through my window, I could see the snow-capped peaks of the Front Range, reminding me of how much larger the world was than Nexus One's small crisis. "Trevor assured me that he understood your systems completely," Helen continued, "but it's become clear that no one else has the access codes or technical knowledge to restore the integration. We need your expertise." "I see," I said neutrally. "And what, exactly, are you proposing?" "I'd like to offer you a consulting contract to fix this problem," she said quickly. "We'll pay your standard consulting rate, plus a completion bonus. This could be resolved in a few days if you're available." I paused, pretending to consider her offer, while actually reviewing the email I had received that morning from a logistics firm in Seattle. They wanted me to design their entire supply chain system, a 6-month project worth more than I had earned in 2 years at Nexus One. "Helen, I appreciate the offer," I said finally, "but I'm afraid I'm not available for that type of work." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Helen spoke again, her voice smaller. "What do you mean you're not available?" "My priorities have changed," I explained, echoing Trevor's own words back to her. "I'm focusing on clients who value long-term partnerships rather than short-term problem-solving. I'm sure Trevor will figure something out." Helen's breathing was audible through the phone as she processed my polite refusal. "Daniela, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your termination. I wasn't involved in Trevor's decision, and I don't think he properly considered the implications." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied gently. "Trevor made it very clear that Nexus One needs employees who put work before personal obligations. I respected his decision and moved on accordingly." "But this is different," Helen protested. "We're talking about a consulting arrangement, not employment. You'd be working as an independent contractor." "I understand the distinction," I said. "But I've already committed to other clients who appreciate my expertise from the beginning of our relationship, rather than only when they're facing a crisis." I could hear Helen conferring with someone in the background, probably Trevor, frantically trying to salvage his reputation. When she returned to the call, her tone had shifted from desperation to something approaching panic. "The Henderson account is worth $2 million annually," she said. "If we lose them, it will impact our entire operation. Surely, we can work something out." "I'm certain you'll find a solution," I assured her. "Trevor mentioned that no one is irreplaceable, so I'm confident he'll demonstrate that principle." "Daniela, please." Helen's professional facade finally cracked. "I'm asking for your help not just as CEO of Nexus One, but as someone who genuinely regrets what happened to you. Trevor made a terrible mistake." "I appreciate your honesty, Helen," I said, meaning it. "But I learned from my grandfather that respect is earned through consistency, not crisis management. When someone shows you who they really are, it's wise to believe them." I could hear papers shuffling and muffled voices as Helen struggled to find some argument that might change my mind. There was nothing she could say that would repair the damage Trevor had caused, and we both knew it. "I have to respect your decision," she said finally, defeat evident in her voice. "But if you change your mind—" "I won't," I assured her. "But I wish you the best in resolving this situation." After ending the call, I returned to my consulting work, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes from professional validation. My new clients valued my expertise enough to plan projects around my availability, to seek my input during the planning phase, rather than only when their systems failed. That afternoon, Jenna texted me an update. Henderson account officially terminated their contract. Trevor's been called into emergency meetings with the board. Word is he might be demoted or worse. I did not reply to her message, but I felt a deep sense of completion. Grandpa Elias had taught me that justice was not about punishment, but about natural consequences. Trevor had chosen to prioritize his ego over competence, to steal credit rather than earn it, and to fire the person whose knowledge he needed most. The consequences were simply the inevitable result of his choices. By the time November snow began falling on Denver, Trevor had been quietly transferred to a junior position in Nexus, one's struggling Phoenix office. Helen had hired an expensive consulting firm to rebuild the systems I had created, but they lacked the institutional knowledge that made those systems effective. 3 more major clients had switched to competitors, and Nexus One's reputation in the Colorado logistics market had suffered permanent damage. Meanwhile, my consulting practice was thriving. I had built a client base that valued expertise over availability, results over presence, and long-term relationships over short-term exploitation. Most importantly, I had honored my grandfather's memory by demonstrating that dignity and competence were more powerful than desperation and deception. Sometimes, the best revenge was simply being excellent at what you do, while allowing others to face the consequences of their own poor judgment. As I reflected on my journey from devoted employee to independent consultant, I realized that losing my job at Nexus One had been the greatest professional gift I could have received. It forced me to discover my true worth in a market that rewarded competence rather than loyalty, and showed me that standing up for family was always the right choice, no matter what the cost.